you're given, that's how we live it. Don't be mad at the system, it's simply how we've existed. I hear a lot of people talking like they politicians and choose to be an accountant because it's safe in a business. Not because they want to do it, just because they heard it pays. And who the fuck wants to be poor knowing that's how we've been raised? Society is getting heavy, I can feel the weight. The pressure of success is like 100 million pounds of shit.
How you guys doing today? It's Anthony Gangi. Welcome to another episode of Tier Talk. All right, guys, so we're going to be talking about what to do when one of the staff members, volunteers, whoever, get threatened by an inmate. Now, there's different ways that an inmate can obviously threaten a staff member. We'll go over that. Also, there's different motivations for a threat, by the way. Sometimes it could be just to get someone off the unit because they're doing their job. So there's a lot of areas here that we can actually look into. But the key is always to provide a safe and secure facility. So we want to make sure that we take each threat seriously. Now, again, my guests are going to be the usual. We got Russ Hamilton and Connie Alleyne. Russ, do you mind introducing yourself to our audience? He is my partner for the Tier Talk podcast, by the way, which gets released every Friday at 1 o'clock. What's up, Russ?
Hey, everyone. My name is Russ Hamilton. I have 27 years with California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, retired as a sergeant. Went on to work at a juvenile detention facility in Northern California just to try and get a little bit more experience in the field, as it were. And now, as Anthony says, I partner with him on the podcast for Law Enforcement Today and contributor over there at Tier Talk. And I run a Facebook page called Keepers of Chaos for corrections professionals.
Yes, and the page is growing. Great community there, guys. So if you get a chance and you're on Facebook, check it out. And if you're not on Facebook, it's a good reason to join. There's a very good community, professionals out there, and I believe we're having an impact, especially on the new people that are coming in on the into the profession. Connie, what's going on? Now, Connie, say everything that you do.
Hi, Connie Alleyne here. I am the founder and president of the Civilian Corrections Academy. I come to you guys with 10 years of experience from Rikers Island, another 5 years in Connecticut Department of Corrections as Prison Health Services Administrator. And I am a criminal justice professor at Monroe College. I'm having tons of fun with the kids. I'm also a podcast host, The Fly Behind the Wall. And I do a little something called Conversations with Connie. So thank you for having me as usual.
As usual? Why'd you have to add that part in?
I like being here. It's good having these dialogues and really talking through all of the experiences that we've all had, seeing how we all kind of align and we have so much in common. We just don't realize it.
No, it was just a good election of a word there, as usual. And I noticed the word went down. Like, thanks for having me aboard, as usual. You know what I mean? Hey, I just want to read something before we go to our sponsor. Okay, so the other day, me, Connie, and Louis Soto did an episode. Louis Soto is a retired major, currently now a college professor, on what you miss most about, being frontline now that you're in management. And it was a great dialogue. We really had no idea where we were going with it. But, you never know what topic brings back a pretty good response of someone who not only enjoyed it, but's going to do something with it. So I just want to read a response I got from Michael Rosenthal, who listens to all our episodes. So Mike, where we're talking about you right now, he sent this great response. Now, Mike, he works for the BOP, non-specific guys. I'm not going to tell you which facility, but the reason why I'm saying the BOP is because Mike has a dual function. He's a teacher and an officer because the civilians are trained as if they are custody as well. So he has a dual role. But let me just read this to you. So again, the episode that he's commenting on was an episode that we did yesterday about what you miss most when you go into management, which is really a very good personal dialogue that me, Connie, and Louis had shared. So this is what he sends, and I think it meant a lot to us. Hey, Anthony, I really appreciate that video that you posted to YouTube recently about what managers miss when they move up. I have considered moving up where I am, but you were dead on and hit on why moving up scares me personally. 1, I know my time will not be mine anymore. 2, I know that my relationship with my coworkers will have to change and I will have to make peace with that. And 3, most of all, I like teaching literacy classes and handling audit paperwork for our literacy program, and I like to leave it at work when I'm done. But I would really encourage line staff to watch your video because it reminded me of ways I need to help my boss and make their job better. That's powerful. And I also like to add, he sent another comment that says, Tell Connie that the Civilian Corrections Academy website rocks. I love part of her website that talks about aid in the navigation of conflict and bureaucracy. Hey, Connie, before we go to sponsors, oh, Connie, there's an empty chair there. Oh, there we go. Sorry, guys. Connie disappeared on me, and I was nervous. Hey, Connie, real quick, before we go to our sponsor, what does that mean? That he was very taken aback. He said he loves your website, thinks everything is great. By the way, your website is phenomenal. A lot of good information there. But he says he loves the part on her website that talks about aid in the navigation of conflict and bureaucracy. What does that mean?
So really, it's from a civilian perspective, how do we best support custody while we're juggling our responsibilities to our organization? Most of the time, we do work for a vendor. And so the vendor can give you marching orders. This is their expectations of you, but the vendor is not in the facility. So you have to learn how to have certain conversations so that you can still meet the need of the vendor and still fall in line with custody's expectations and do your job. And so that's really what that's about.
And did you expect for people to relate to that like that? I mean, that's a pretty good connection.
I didn't. That's great. I'm glad that he's relating to it. I mean,
yeah,
it goes to show more of us are in that situation where we're trying to figure it out. I think that's where the role ambiguity comes in.
Yeah, and that was a great topic that we had. We discussed that as well. I mean, you think about it, Russ, Connie, over 750 videos, man. We've covered a lot. This is going to be very interesting. Again, we're going to talk about what to do when staff gets threatened or volunteer, when someone gets threatened by an inmate. Now, guys, if you haven't, the show Tear Talks to you, brave men and women that work in corrections. So please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. The bell's going to notify you every time I post a video. We're going to go to our sponsor. And when we come back, we're going to talk about what to do with threats. Stand by.
I wanted to attend a university that had an intelligence program. I wanted to look at problems different. I wanted to increase my critical thinking abilities. AMU offered those avenues to expand. Obtaining your degree as an adult, you're actually paying yourself and investing in yourself. You can't put a dollar on it, it's priceless. It's something that can never be taken away from you.
American Military University. Learn from the leader.
Guys, inmate manipulation is a course that is highly needed. It's the process that's so slow moving and subtle that you don't realize it's happening. When inmates choose to manipulate, they manipulate our need to react. Situational awareness and insight is going to save your career. It's going to save you from doing foolish things. Listen to your gut. So the more insight we have, the more we can recognize what isn't so overt, and we can correct our behavior before we fall into a trap that we can't get out of. If you allow an inmate to pull you out of your prescribed role, you are opening up a door for a host of problems. Inmate manipulation, the psychology behind inmate manipulation. Available now. Link in description.
And we are back. So, guys, this is a very interesting topic because I'm sure in our career we get threatened all the time, and in some cases they may not be taken seriously. And the funny thing is, we may even say that, okay, maybe the agency itself may not take it seriously, but sometimes we ourselves, the person getting threatened, don't take it seriously. I mean, I've been in situations where we had people that were threatened, and you would have the civilian maybe say, well, I know that person, they didn't mean that. Yeah, well, that's not how I'm going to take that, because God forbid something does happen. I don't care if you know that person or not. They just threatened you. But, hey, Russ, right off the bat, have you ever been threatened?
I've been threatened, yes, quite a number of times, more than I could count, probably more than I can remember at this point after, nearly 30 years in the business. So, yeah, it's something, it can be sobering. Sometimes it can actually be a little bit humorous depending on the inmate that's leveling him. But it's something that nonetheless, no matter which of those two ends of the spectrum it's on, you have to take it seriously. But most of all, your institution and your department should be taking it very, very seriously.
And what about you, Connie? Have you ever been threatened?
So I don't think I ever had the experience of being threatened. I've had staff be threatened as they're in their clinical process with, the population, but I've not had that experience.
So it was more like, hey, fuck you, custody. Connie, it's not on you. You know what I mean? Fuck you, custody, but Connie, you're good. You're good. It's custody, you know. No, but you know what? It sometimes the heat of the moment, you know, it happens. But again, the first thing we're going to mention right now is that every threat, like Russ said, I'm sure, Connie, you agree with, is that threats have to be taken seriously, definitely from the person that's being threatened, and also from the agency or the department, because at any time something does happen, you know, we have to do whatever we can to protect that individual. Now, obviously, there are certain threats that are they're easy to manage, the threats that happen in the moment where there could be a negative interaction between staff and an inmate, and the inmate says something foolish in which we're able to instantly respond. It's not like an anonymous threat. We'll go over that later, which the inmate should go to lock, go through the whole process. And you know what's funny, too? I treat every potential like statement, if it's even slightly ambiguous, like if someone says, you know what, Gangi, next time we're going to have an issue, to me, that's a threat. Let the disciplinary hearing officer figure it out. Well, when I said issue, I meant I'm going to call my lawyer. Sorry, you didn't say that. You said issue. So even if the threat is ambiguous, or even if the threat is, you know, like I said, a simple word like issue, it's not a direct threat, but it could be interpreted as one. Like Russ said, you act on universal precaution because you never know. Like Russ, I'm sure you would agree, if someone came up to you and said, hey, Russ, next time we're going to have an issue, would you take that as a threat?
I absolutely would. And, you know, you have to try and be able to articulate that threat. Now, the fact of the matter is, whether we like it or not, we're often constrained by policy, by the penal code, even in some cases by case law, as to what constitutes an actual threat. Can we, you know, make sure that we get this person out of the facility, or at least, you know, to a more secure location, you know, in SEG or something like that? Yeah, we can do that. You know, we can have our due diligence. We can run the course of an investigation. Actually filing charges or actually getting a disciplinary done may be a different thing. Sometimes we can't make those things stick. Sometimes we can.
Yeah, I would like to think that a threat to staff at minimal is going to be a high level discipline. Again, I don't know if you're going to be able to go for criminal charges. It depends, I guess, at that point, if the threat's carried out. I don't know, but definitely at the institutional level, they should show that there's a zero tolerance and that there's a severe consequence for even just the mention of some form of harm, or, you know, like some form of harm to the staff member. And again, that's up for the agency to determine that, because again, we're going to get threatened all the time in our line of work. Now, again, when we talk about protecting staff, obviously when there is that threat, there has to be the consequence that's involved, because that is a deterrence. But the immediate reaction should be, again, someplace to secure that inmate. They got to be locked, and until that investigation is done and they see if that threat is valid. I would even go as far as, once the person makes the threat, I mean, jails could be different, but if there's multiple facilities, you know, within that one agency, it doesn't hurt to, as a universal precaution, just to ship the inmate out. Even if the inmate's found not guilty, you know what? I'm sorry. I'm still going to ship you out. Shipping out's not punitive. It's just, you know, you're going to go to another facility because obviously right now you're just not a good fit. And that's for the safety of the staff as well as that inmate. So would you be in agreement with that, Russ, that, you know, even if the charge doesn't fit, I would still say that management should go the extra effort and see if they can ship the inmate out, if, like, you know, like a state-run facility where you have multiple prisons?
Yeah, you know, you have to be flexible, and, you know, you have to try and see just what the level of that threat is when you do your assessment. And there's a lot of things that you take into account. I'm always one of the ones, hey, you know, let's err on the side of caution. Yeah, let's go ahead and ship that guy out. Maybe that makes him an example. Maybe that cools things off. It's more difficult if you're, you know, looking at a more generalized threat where it's a threat against perhaps all staff. You know, it just, you know, each individual situation, each individual incident is different. And so you just have to adjust to that accordingly.
Yeah, and when I talk about the threat just now, we're talking about a threat that's immediate in the moment. Maybe there's a heated exchange. and all of a sudden, the inmate says something that's foolish, even if it's something like, I'm going to throw liquid at you next time you come around. It doesn't matter. A threat's a threat, and they get you. Now, those are the threats that we can easily manage right away because it's right there. The tough threats are the threats that may be anonymous or a more, like Russ said, a more generalized threat could also be tough to handle. But basically, it's how we react in an effort to protect. And now I know, Connie, on the civilian side, do you train staff in what to do when a threat comes their way, how to interpret a threat? And, because believe it or not, I know people think that a threat is easily interpreted, but it may not be. It could be a subtle thing that the inmate says, or it could be something in the tonality of how they said something. Like, a threat sometimes is not so much what the words mean. It could be just the way the person said it. Like, I'll believe it or not, if I see an inmate tell a female staff member, hey, you're looking good, I could take that as a threat to the female staff member. What do you mean by that? That could be beyond a compliment, depending on how they say that. So do we teach staff how to, determine what a threat is and what to do with the threat?
So absolutely. We've sat through many trainings with custody to really gain an understanding of what threats are, what they look like, the different tones of voice, the body language. Sometimes it's, the head nod or the subtle gestures, we've been taught to pick up on to identify the threat, even though one hasn't necessarily been articulated explicitly. What I've witnessed is when there's been a threat against staff, we have to do our reporting, we send it up through the custody chain. Sometimes it resulted in creating a profile against an inmate, and so that inmate and staff could never kind of be in the same place. Inmate gets transitioned out depending on the severity of the threat. The consequences may vary, but for the most part, I think we feel comfortable, as civilian staff, knowing that once we go to custody and say, hey, listen, this is what we experienced, that you guys have been very reactive and responsive to, those threats. And I think some of the challenge, which you talked about a little earlier, comes in when the inmate is making a threat and it's not taken seriously. I was like, oh, he says that, he doesn't mean anything by it. I think that we get this false sense of security in thinking that he doesn't mean anything about it. It's that one day that he's made the threat and he makes good on that threat. And, we're like, where did that come from? And you've got the staff saying, oh, well, he said stuff before, but I never really paid it any attention. For us, like, our reality is that we've got to take those serious.
Yeah. And sometimes, believe it or not, when it came to what I mentioned about the person not taken seriously, sometimes it could be mental health too, because when mental health is trying to really get down to the foundation of a concern with an inmate who may have a severe mental health issue, they may have to deal with a bunch of stuff coming their way. And again, they may just say, okay, well, this is who he is. I think, yeah, but, like you said, there's still a chance that he can carry that out. So, I guess there's going to be a bit of, there's definitely got to be a trusting relationship between mental health and custody as well, because sometimes custody may hear it, but it could be part of trying to get this inmate to where they need to be. But for me, as custody, just having that background, a threat's a threat. I'm not going to sit there and entertain anything more that inmate has to say, where mental health may feel that they have to be tolerant to certain things to get to the root of the issue. But hey, Russ, I'm sure you've had that right before, with maybe some concerns with mental health where they may not have wanted to take it to the next level, but you yourself believe that it should be at that next level because, a threat's a threat regardless of what goal you're trying to reach.
Yeah, I've always been one, I let mental health do what mental health does. And that involves treatment or something. The part that we deal with, though, is the part that involves, the actual penal code, regardless of the status of that inmate. If he has the ability to carry out his threat and he's done something or said something either explicit or implicit, and it's enough that we need to take it seriously, then we shouldn't be bowing down to, mental health just taking the tack that, well, this guy, he says that he never acts on it. Well, he's never acted on it until the time where he actually does act on it. And, you know, I know of lots of instances where these guys, you know, it's a matter of they condition themselves. You know, they come up to the line and they move back away from it. They come up to the line and they start emboldening themselves. I mean, how many of us have seen videos where an inmate will come up and approach an officer and then leave and come back and do that 5-6 times. And then on the 8th time, suddenly, you know, there's an issue. Suddenly there's an attack. There's a battery on the officer. And, you know, you can see it ahead of time. And it was just a matter of people not recognizing the signs there at that particular moment. So, like I say, two distinct things, what mental health does and what we do.
Right, but you also mentioned something where it adds to it with the context of the inmate himself. You know, the inmate may be making these general threats, but he has a history of acting out on these general threats. I mean, there have been some times where an inmate could say, like, you know, I have a bad day, I feel like hurting someone. Well, Gangi, it wasn't specific, so yeah, but it doesn't matter because the inmate does have a history of hurting individuals. So, you know, even though hurting someone is a generalized threat, you know, it's still a threat. Some may say, well, it's not specific enough, and therefore they may negate the seriousness of that threat. But having said that, there is a someone. Someone could be anyone. So sometimes a generalized threat, or actually, I'm sorry, it should be taken serious regardless. But again, you know, it's just more of how we need to work with mental health sometimes and try to get that understanding. But at the end of the day, they really need to know why we need to take it up that next level. Because if something does happen, we'll be held liable. And that's a big part of what we're going to discuss right now. Because when we deal with a threat, now we're going to push over to anonymous threats, because anonymous threats are the ones that are hard, because usually anonymous threats that come our way could also be a motivation from the population to get somebody off that unit. Let's say it's an officer, and the officer is doing some searches and they're getting ready to find something. They know immediately if they put an anonymous threat, we're going to react, and in an effort to protect the officer, we're going to remove that officer and then try to investigate. But most likely, you're not going to be able to match the handwriting. It's going to be very hard to figure out who said the threat, but the inmate gets what they want. They get that officer removed from the unit, and then they're able to do whatever it is that they feel they could do. Because I'll tell you something, good officers get a lot of anonymous threats. Russ, would you agree with that?
Yeah, and that's one of those situations where sometimes you can't help having to remove that officer from the scene. But one thing that you can always at least try and do, if you can identify or at least get some idea of what the reason might be behind that particular removal, is make it really expensive for the inmates. You know, go on, do your due diligence with regards to your investigation and everything. But then beyond that, I think it's time to start, doing some mass searches and trying to figure out, how to get to the bottom of the whole thing. Maybe if you keep on disrupting whatever it is that they're trying to achieve, then it becomes much harder for them to justify, at least in their own minds, just taking some kind of action like that, where they're just, deciding that they're going to try and take an officer out with paperwork and just try and because they're trying to take us out of our game. They're trying to disrupt what we normally do. So we have to counter that.
And guess who gets a lot of those anonymous threats? Medical requests. Connie already smiled before I even said it, because she knows. And your staff, I'm sure, will be going through those boxes. It's anonymous because it's a great way for inmates to put something in anonymously. So what happens when staff receives one of those anonymous threats?
So we have to go through the process, especially when we're going through the box of requests. Essentially, we bring those requests up to custody. If it's related to any of the medical staff, usually it's because we have inmates possibly doctor shopping. So they'll say something that's threatening against one particular doctor who may not be willing to prescribe the medication that they're looking for, or who may not be willing to write some sort of note, like whatever it is their secondary gain is. Typically, we find those in our boxes. Oftentimes, especially given the relationship we've had with the clinic captains and the clinic officers, we take them to the officers and we're like, what is this? A lot of times it's a part of, it's an education piece for civilians because we don't oftentimes come in contact with that. And like, they'll let us know, I mean, oh, we've got a couple of these, you know, or, you know, this handwriting looks like something else they saw. So for us, we're only like, this is like an isolated piece of the puzzle. And many times you guys have already doing your due diligence. And this is just another piece that you're identifying that's going to help you solve like the bigger mystery. But we see them coming in through the health request box, through the dental box, and then they send some directly to me, which I'm going through those and I'm trying to identify like who's sending this and why, you know, because it's usually not for the reason that is on the paper.
Right, and I would like to add that when you're going through those boxes, you should be wearing gloves because, you know, in case you got to fingerprint something, because once you have a shitload of fingerprints on it, it ruins it. So sometimes if you have that anonymous threat, the first thing your investigative division may ask was, who else touched this note? And if it was touched by everyone, then there's really nothing you could do with it. But if everybody was wearing gloves and you kind of make note of, okay, well, because you want to limit the amount of people that note goes to. So, you know, let's say you got it. You give it to your officer. Maybe what I would do, honestly, if I was the officer and I got that note, I would call a supervisor. And here's what I would do, because I want to keep chain of evidence with the minimal amount of people possible. I would have an officer as a supervisor cover me, the one that got the note, so I can go ahead and do the continuity of evidence form just to keep minimal amount of hands possible on that bit of evidence. In some cases, some supervisors will say, well, you know what? We'll give this to, another officer to bring it up. No. Let the unit officer bring it up. Let them do the paperwork, because now we only had two hands on it. We only had the medical person who received it and then the officer who got it. And at all times, you have to push gloves. And it's got as far where if your medical staff, let's say, gives you it and you know that they touched it with their bare hands, it could in some cases lead to some form of if not minimal retraining, but could be eventually discipline, because it's so important that, you know, we're able to see if we can fingerprint that, because that probably is our number way, best chance. I'm trying to say the right, our best chance of, I messed up, number one way, I don't know what I was trying to say, our best chance at identifying who that could be. But do you stress the importance, Connie, of when you're going through those medical boxes that you need to go on with those gloves?
So, yeah, I mean, we keep gloves on all the time just because, I mean, honestly, it's nasty, you know, like you never know what you're going to unfold in those letters to begin with. So we generally have our gloves on as we're going through those. And usually you have the box next to us, because if we've got to swap out those gloves because it got dirty off of something or soiled because of something that was already on or that we came across in the box, then that's what we do. But yeah, we do push that we go through those letters with gloves on.
And the reason why I said that you hand it off to custody is because custody is the one that's going to have to do the continuity of evidence. For anybody watching on the outside, I know you're probably thinking, well, why not have medical do it? Medical can't do the continuity of evidence. That has to come from a custody individual, custody personnel. But Russ, again, real quick, just want to touch on this again with the continuity of evidence. Would you agree, as you know, if that note's found, you got the gloves, you go ahead and medical gives it to the officer, that should be the person that, you know, minimal hands, right? Minimal hands.
Yeah, the fewer people you can keep in the chain, the better. Whenever I was doing it, whenever I was handling evidence, it would just, you know, depend on the circumstance. A lot of times, non-custody weren't real comfortable, trying to go through the whole evidence thing because they didn't know how it worked. I'd usually hold their hand through it if it would keep one more person out of the loop. But most of the time, you know, I would just have them sign a receipt of that particular piece of evidence over to me. Sometimes, if I didn't think that it was gonna, interfere with the forensics on it, I could have them, you know, perhaps initial it or something like that. But you know, it would just depend.
Right, and also when we talk about the anonymous notes, if it's hard to identify the threat, but again, you still have to treat it seriously, even though it's anonymous. Oh, they're doing it again because Russ Hamilton's, you know, finding these contraband items and they just want them off the unit. You still have to go through the process. So guess what has to happen? One thing is they're definitely going to have to talk to Officer Russ Hamilton. They're going to have to make sure that Russ Hamilton is okay with going back to the unit. So let's start with that first, because I think to me, that's the liability part of it all from the agency. So what's going to happen here is I have an anonymous note. I can't identify where it's coming from at all, right? So one thing is maybe there's a threat. I don't know. But let me go ahead and interview the officer that was specifically threatened, because, again, it's a specific threat to this officer. And basically, let me see if they have any concerns. But the end result is, are you willing to sign something that says you're okay with going back into that unit? And, Russ, you know that's obviously done for a liability part, because if something was to happen, you know, we can always go back to that statement and say, well, you're okay working it. Doesn't mean we still have a due diligence here, don't get me wrong. But that interview with that officer has to happen from either the investigative division or, you know, it has to happen from a higher level of authority. But Russ, you agree with that, right? That if there's an anonymous threat, we do have to interview the person being threatened.
Oh yeah, we have to. You know, first of all we have to notify him. And you know, I've gotten that telephone call before. You know, I've had you know, a supervisor call me up, the investigations lieutenant, and say, hey, guess what? You know, there's a threat against you. So there is that element of it. You know, and you should always be willing to take the input of that officer. But you know, it doesn't just having the officer say that they want to return to work, because there's some of us that are going to go out there and return no matter what. It doesn't really do anything to actually diminish the liability of the department, because they have to do what they think is ultimately right. What it does do, though, is it shows that that person was consulted, and if you consult with that individual, and the upshot of it is that, you know, both sides agree that this particular threat can be mitigated, then a return is in order. If there's no way to mitigate that threat, or if the threat is of such a significant nature that you just don't think it's in the best interest of that individual returning, no matter what they say, then you have to pull them out of that. And after you pull them out of that, once again, you have to make it expensive for the inmate or for the STG or whatever caused this to happen, so that they know that, you know what, they're not going to get away with just, you know, having people pulled off of the yard. It has to be a real ordeal for them. And whether that includes, you know, mass searches or people being shipped out to other institutions to make them uncomfortable, then that's what you have to do.
Yeah, you touched on a lot there. So let me just, I want to summarize some of that, because you hit on a lot of important things here. So when I meant the due diligence, you're 100% correct. I said the due diligence because you have to let that officer know, or that staff member know, that there was a threat on them. So there is a sense of liability where I got to let them know. If I don't let them know, that's going to be a problem. But also the statement from the staff member saying that they're okay to go back into that area. Again, but the due diligence, I love what you said. There's an anonymous threat. Let's at least search that unit. You know, exhaust whatever you can to protect that staff member. And I like how you say, because that's going to inconvenience the unit. They probably got the staff member off because he was doing searches, but now we're really going to go in. You're not going to get what you want. You know, we're going to do searches, and we're going to do whatever we can to make sure that it's safe for that officer to return. So I want management to realize this, because I don't think that's something that they pick up on, Russ, and I'm glad that you mentioned it, is when you have that anonymous threat, there should be a follow-up. There should be, okay, I don't know who it is. Screw it. Let's search that whole officer's area, that whole staff member's area. Let's do something to make it inconvenient for them to do this again. Because at the end, we know what their motivation is, and they didn't get it. And then hopefully the officer is able to come back. But it's great you mentioned that, because I have a feeling there isn't that mass search after there's that anonymous threat. Because what they could say is, well, we can't determine who it is. They'll just interview the officer or whoever the staff member is and feel that they'll be done with it. When mostly, even if let's say you have a medical staff member that works in the hospital, right? The weapon is probably not going to be in the inmate's housing unit and they have to bring it over. The weapon's probably going to be somewhere in the infirmary, in the hospital, because they're not going to want to get caught bringing it over. So they'll find a way to make the weapon when they're there. So again, do that search. Do whatever you can to show the inmates that we're taking this seriously. Even if we don't know who it is, now we're going to hold every inmate up on this. But Connie, have you ever seen that? Like, if you had, well, let me ask you a question, Connie. So if you had a staff member that and we can start wrapping it up soon, but I just want to get one more thing off. If you had a staff member that was threatened and it was anonymous, what would you expect to be done in return to protect your staff member? What would you want to see?
So I would certainly want there to be, so there are times where we have escort officers and there's times where we don't. I think that when there is that threat, that it would be more important that if you are in that space where we would have an escort officer with us, that certainly that would be an expectation. I think also to just maybe some increased awareness training for the staff. So like there's ways that we just don't know what to look for. We don't know necessarily some of the warning signs that Russ talked about. Like if we can actually get some of that training and gain those insights, it would help us to really help you guys protect us, right? So instead of us being ignorant to some of the things that we just don't know, I think that would really, really help us. And I think also too, just there being, more of a presence in the medical or mental health unit, wherever that threat has been announced or where we know that threat has been, I guess, laid out or whatever the note says, right? I would just expect there to be some sort of presence there so that the opportunity isn't presented for the threat to be carried out.
I've even seen stuff where, I like what you said about the opportunity, limit it. So I've even seen stuff where, you're in a let's say an infirmary section. I know we can't, move the patients around, again, be anonymous, but you may have some management that says, you know what, for safety, we could let's fire the porters, hire new ones. And it could suck, but again, inmates are replaceable. Do I think it's extreme? I actually don't think it's extreme. I think if you can't identify the threat, but you think it's valid, in most cases, at least interview the porters, see if you could, determine if it's a valid threat or not. But if you can't determine it's valid or not, then reset, reinvent the wheel, get rid of the porters, try to get new people in. But having said that, sometimes you have to take that next level, because I also think that also gives that level of respect to the civilian, that they show that we care for their well-being. So when you see custody come into play, when you one more question for you, Connie, actually. So now, this is where you actually see custody play that role, where now they're out to protect you, your staff, and that's when you see the seriousness of what custody does. But you must feel a certain way when, let's say you do have a staff member that's threatened and you see custody, you see the investigation, you see it being taken seriously. And, it says a lot. For one thing about the dedication from custody, but also that you're important to the house, that we want to protect you. So, I think that, again, that carries a lot of weight, right? That when that happens and you start to see where custody steps up to protect that staff member.
Absolutely. It allows you to see that you're part of the team and that, you matter, your presence matter, and what happens to you matter. I think we do see the camaraderie that exists amongst officers. And because we don't have that same relationship, we don't necessarily feel like we have that bond or that we're part of the family. And so when something like that happens, and we do have the officers who are stepping up, who are present, who are there trying to make sure that we're protected and nothing happens to us, you feel absolutely great. I feel like those are the things that feed into our ability to function more cohesively, because we do feel like we're part of the team.
I got one more area I want to cover, and then I think we can start to wrap it up. And I'll start with Russ first. And I want to discuss, because this is a different type of threat. And I'm not talking about threats that carry out of the facility. That's going to be for a later topic. We could save that for another discussion, because I think that's a whole nother discussion in itself. But I do want to talk about threats from shot callers. So threats from inmates that have a bit of influence over other inmates. And that could be a very serious threat, because you don't know when or who. Sometimes we may have to lock up a high-level inmate, an inmate that has rank and influence. And the problem is that inmate could make a blanket threat. Something as simple as, all right, man, we'll get you. We don't know who we is. We don't know when. And this is when the institution has to make a decision that's really based on universal precaution, which could even go as far as a lockdown if needed. If you can't determine that there's a threat, but there's some validity because of the rank of this individual, because of the level of this individual. And who helps us out with that is intelligence that's been built from, custody and the investigative divisions that can say, well, this person's a high-level individual. So you know what, maybe we should secure this facility for a little bit, do an investigation because of this person's influence, and maybe do something with that shot caller, which limits their influence on the population. But Russ, let's talk about a threat from a high-level gang member. You worked in California, man. I mean, how serious should these be taken?
Yeah, it's extremely serious. That's why one of the things that you always want to try and maintain is that ability to be able to reach out and be able to interrupt whatever any particular STG is doing. You can't do it all the time, obviously, but if you can manage to do something where you do inconvenience them, or at least you maybe take them off their game, it really pays off. We just saw down south here in California at Richard J. Donovan, we had multiple officers stabbed, and that right now tends to look like it was done at the behest of a particular STG and one particular shot caller. So, it's always going to behoove us to know who those people are, to be able to try and take them off of their game. If they do make threats, however innocuous, we need to be moving those individuals around. And whether that's, to seg in a temporary fashion or to some other facility in a more permanent fashion, or a little bit of bus therapy, then so be it. But there's, unfortunately, there's probably not too many easy answers out there. But those are just some of the things you really have to take into consideration. Taking one shot caller out of the equation may impact it in a positive manner, and it may not. You may have to take the shot caller out of the equation and 5, 10, 15, 20 other people in order to neutralize a threat like that. That's why you really do have to be deep in the intelligence aspect to be able to identify the people, to be able to identify the threat, and then be able to come up with a solution that fits within the parameters of what your policy, procedure, and the law really allows for.
Yeah, and I would also like to add that the investigative division is the one that investigates these threats. I believe they could also put pressure on the shot caller to the point where anything happens to this staff member, you will be held responsible based on the threat that you just made. And that may even go beyond an institutional charge. I mean, at that point here, when you have someone with that high level of influence, I would hope that the AG or somebody will stand by and be willing to help us prosecute the individual who made that threat. Because again, when it's someone that has that much of an influence, it can make it very hard for us to maintain the safety of staff, because you're never going to know when. I mean, the funny thing is, here's the crazy thing. They may wait for the most quietest of times. It could be months later, and all of a sudden it's an all-out war, because sometimes it's planned and they got all the time in the world to wait. So when you're dealing with those inmates that have some influence, never take anything that they say lightly. And I could speak on that because I know people who have gotten caught up on the other end of that, where they just didn't take it seriously enough. And unfortunately, some of them aren't even back to work at this point. Sad to say. I won't say who they are. Unfortunately, I can't, but they're not back at work. So again, a threat from a shot caller is a whole different level. And I would also say that besides moving that shot caller, trying to limit their influence, I also believe at some point, then I think that the staff member should also maybe be in an area where there's limited inmate contact, just for the time being. Again, just for the time being, until we can determine when we feel we've done enough in investigation. Because I don't think this is an investigation that is completed within 24 to 48 hours. I think it's in a lengthy investigation because you have, like Russ said, you have many people that could be involved, and therefore. Maybe for the best interest of the staff, I know some staff may not like this, but for the safety of the staff, maybe you should be put out a post that does have limited contact with the inmate population until we can determine that the threat has been alleviated, at least to the best of our abilities. But I think that if you rush to interview the officer or the staff member and put them right back in, that's going to be a concern, you know? So at least do what you can and do, like Russ said, let's not ignore that. Do some movement, move people around. And that, again, that's not going to happen overnight, because you could find out that there's a sleeper that's part of the gang that no one knows about, or a wannabe that's trying to get into the gang that was never identified. The wannabes are the ones that are the, and you know what, one last thing before we go, that's why it's always good to have a good connect with medical too, by the way, because sometimes medical during their evaluations of an inmate, they may see a new tattoo that we don't get to see, and they should be able to say, hey, this is new, and then give it to the experts to see, hey, what is this inmate trying to do, who they're trying to belong to, or is it just a random tattoo? So that connection matters. Hey, Connie, you have anything you want to say in closing and dealing with threats, and any advice that you may give to a civilian staff member who either gets threatened or receives a threat about someone else?
I would just say that, you know, don't just dismiss the threat. Don't just say, you know, this happens, it's no big deal. You know, I think a lot of times we bury it under the therapeutic process. I don't think that should be the case as well. I mean, granted, in the mental health realm, there are some allowances that are made, but I feel like threats are not those ones that you want to take the risk on. So if you are being threatened or there has been a threat made, just escalate it, because you will protect yourself and you can be protecting your colleagues.
Well said. I agree with, obviously, 100%. Hey, Russ, you have anything you want to say in closing?
Yeah, you know, when we're discussing a subject like this, it's hard to really get too specific, because we have so many different departments and there's so many different variables. The really important thing is to think it through and to try and think outside the box, try and find ways to change things up in a manner where you can get to the bottom of it, and try and always make it expensive for that STG or that individual person for making those threats. You know, make it where it's just not a good idea, you know, and above all else, always protect yourself, always stay safe, and don't give in to complacency. You know, stay frosty, stay aware.
And I think the key is, at the end of the dialogue here, is to do what you can to try to neutralize that threat, and really not something that can be rushed all the time. You have to do a proper investigation and make sure that when that employee goes back to their post, that's as safe for them as possible. And again, that really does take time, especially when you're getting a threat from someone that has a lot of influence. You got to know exactly where that influence can go. And that's where you have to talk to that front line and people that are involved in those investigations. Because if you don't, there's going to be people out there that you're not going to know about. And those people there are the ones that are going to be successful in doing what has been assigned to them to do. And then they'll wind up being successful, because not only they hurt the staff member or possibly kill them, but guess what? They just became part of the gang. Recruitment still happens in prison, and these are some of the things that they do to be recruited. As always, guys, the show is tiered. If you haven't, please subscribe, interact, engage, comment, hit that bell. Bell's going to notify you every time I post up a video. Stay safe.